Hello and welcome to the final course. I'm Stephanie Hicks, I'll be your host, and this is the inaugural episode of the final course. So I wanted to give you a little bit of insight into why I started this podcast before we delve into the first person that we're going to be examining today. I started this podcast because I am a fan of true crime and have been for many, many years, even before it became popular. I love a lot of content that is put out by different creators, but I wanted to look at something a little different. I stumbled across an article about a prisoner and their last meal, and it got me to thinking, and I started doing some research and found that I was fascinated by the variances between what these prisoners request for their final meals. You have some that totally reject a final meal, and then you have some that want everything under the sun. I also found it fascinating that there are different allowances and different requirements for different states regarding the final meal. It also started me thinking about the death penalty itself, which has been something that I've thought about many times over the years, and I have some opinions on, and we'll get into that a little later. Probably not this episode, but I definitely want to take a look at the death penalty as a whole in a later episode. Just so you know a little bit about me, as I said, my name is Stephanie Hicks. I am from North Carolina, born and raised, been here all my life. So you will definitely hear my southern drawl coming out at times, and there may be things that I don't say correctly, I don't pronounce correctly, or I may use some slang term that if you are not from North Carolina, you may not understand. All that being said, I don't want this to be a quote-unquote professional podcast because I'm not a professional. I am putting this out there merely for my enjoyment and hopefully for the enjoyment of you guys that are listening. I want to talk to you the way a person talks to a friend because I definitely want feedback from you. I want to interact with the people that are listening. This is what I developed this podcast for. So again, the final course will be examining the life and crimes of various prisoners who were executed on death row and the last meals that they ordered and how that makes us feel, what that says about them as a person. Does it say anything at all? And ultimately, is it even important? How do we feel about a prisoner's final meal? There are so many things that go into this and so many different nuances, and I want to cover them all. But for now, we're going to start in on our first prisoner that I wanted to shine a light on, and that is Velma Barfield. Velma Barfield was born Margie Velma Bullard on October the 29th, 1932. Now, I did run across some sources that listed her birth date as October the 23rd, but for the sake of this episode, we're going to go with October the 29th, since that is what is listed on the Find a Grave website, findagrave.com, where it shows that she is buried in Parkton Cemetery in Parkton, Robeson County, North Carolina. She was born in Eastover, North Carolina, which is a small town in Cumberland County, North Carolina, 7 miles from Fayetteville. She was born to Murphy and Lillian Bullard. She was the oldest girl and second of 9 children. They were a poor family and strict Pentecostal Christians. Her father, Murphy, was allegedly physically and sexually abusive, and Lillian ignored it. Now, anything that I say allegedly is because I could not find substantiating proof to prove that that was true. So this is something that was said by witnesses, other people who were in the know, so to speak. And she was born in a small town, and when I say that, just to give you an idea, especially if you're not from North Carolina, Eastover, the town where she was born, as of 2022, had a population of 3,692. compared to if you know anything about Greensboro. Greensboro population as of 2022 was 301,115. So quite a difference. So Greensboro population is 10 times the population of Eastover. Just to give you an idea of how small the town was that she was from. And if you know anything about rural life in North Carolina, especially back in the 30s, things were quite a bit different than they are now. She dropped out of high school and married Thomas Burke in 1949 when she was only 17 years old. And within a couple of years, she had 2 children, her son Ron and daughter Kim. By all accounts, the marriage was good until around 1965 or 66. I saw both years in the material I was looking at. So around that time, 65 or 66, Thomas was in an automobile accident and suffered some severe head injuries that led to him becoming unable to work. Velma, in turn, worked in a textile mill, and I saw that she worked at a store for a short time to help provide for the family and to make ends meet, but subsequently left due to medical issues, which resulted in an emergency hysterectomy. Now, after his automobile accident, it's reported that Burke rapidly became an alcoholic. And in turn, Velma started taking tranquilizers and antidepressants, mainly because of the stress that she was under and how her family was falling apart, and also because of having the emergency hysterectomy. She had some feelings about herself as a woman. She was very young, and also, again, from the rural South, women were expected to have kids and have a family, and all of this was kind of deteriorating in front of her eyes. She eventually ended up having a mental breakdown, which led to her having an addiction to various drugs such as tranquilizers, sleeping pills, antidepressants, and barbiturates, even going to multiple doctors to obtain these prescriptions. Barfield's addiction led to overdosing and subsequent hospital treatment, resulting in 4 admissions from 1972 to 1975. On April 4th, 1969, Burke started drinking. The couple ended up having a fight, and then he passed out, at which time Barfield took her kids and ran some errands, and when they came back, they found that the house had caught fire and Burke was dead from smoke inhalation. A few months after the fire that killed Burke, the house caught fire again, this time burning it to the ground. So Barfield ends up moving back home with her parents, taking her 2 children with her. She didn't stay there long because in August of 1970, she ended up marrying Jennings Barfield. But that didn't last either. Jennings ended up dying on March the 22nd, 1971, roughly 6 months or so after their marriage. He dies from either heart failure or a heart attack. I saw both being thrown out there when I was researching this. After Velma and her kids move back in with her parents again, her father dies of lung cancer, and then her mother becomes ill. In the summer of 1975, Lillian, her mother, began complaining of severe stomach pain, diarrhea, vomiting, and nausea, and was later admitted to an area hospital where her symptoms subsided and she was sent home a few days later. Velma started taking jobs around town as a caretaker, but in 1975, she was convicted of 7 counts of writing bad checks and was sentenced to 6 months in prison. She was released after having served only 3 months. Then by 1976, she was working caring for Montgomery and Dolly Edwards in Lumberton, North Carolina. Montgomery fell ill and died on January the 29th, 1977, and then Dolly began experiencing symptoms that were identical to Lillian's and died just over a month later on March the 1st. The following year, Barfield took on another caretaker job working for John Henry and Record Lee. I have to stop here and just say I absolutely loved this woman's name. I have never heard of another person called Record, Record, Record Lee. You got to be from the South to have a name like that. Anyway, so she's working for John Henry and Record Lee, and Record had suffered a broken leg, so that's why they needed a caretaker. Then on June 3rd, 1977, Lee's husband, John Henry, started having similar symptoms to Dolly Edwards and Lillian Bullard and died soon afterwards. His doctors diagnosed it as a, quote, severe stomach virus. Around this time, Velma had started a new relationship with a man named Roland Stewart Taylor. He was a widower and a tobacco farmer, and he was also a relative of Dolly Edwards. And Velma soon moved in with him. It wasn't long she started forging checks from Taylor's account to pay for her addiction to prescription drugs. Then in 1978, Taylor and Barfield were at a Pentecostal revival in Cumberland County when Taylor began to complain of severe stomach pain. Sound familiar? He was later admitted to the hospital and ended up dying a few days later on February the 3rd, 1978 in Lumberton, North Carolina. An anonymous tip and an autopsy report showing arsenic from rat poison in Taylor's system led to Velma being arrested and charged with his murder on May 13th, 1978. Interestingly enough, one source that I found said that it was Barfield's own sister who tearfully called police and told them that Barfield had murdered Taylor and others. And it is alleged that when Barfield was confronted by her own son about Taylor's murder, Barfield replied, quote, "I only meant to make him sick," end quote. Barfield ultimately confessed to using arsenic to poison Taylor, Montgomery and Dolly Edwards, John Henry Lee, and her mother, Lillian Burke. Velma always attended the funerals of her victims and appeared to genuinely grieve for them. But her motives for these murders were all the same. She had misappropriated money from her victims and then, according to her, tried to make them ill so she could nurse them while finding another job to enable her to repay the money. She had even taken out a fraudulent loan under her mother's name. Despite her confession, Velma continued to deny that she had anything to do with the murders of Thomas Burke or Jennings Barfield, even though Jennings was exhumed after her arrest and traces of arsenic were found in his body. Despite confessing to multiple murders, Barfield was only charged and tried for the murder of Stuart Taylor, to which she pleaded insanity. Barfield appeared cold and uncaring on the stand, it was reported, and she even gave the district attorney a round of applause when he made his closing speech. So yeah, maybe there was a justification for the insanity plea there. You don't root for the other team. But in December 1978, Barfield was convicted of the first-degree murder of Roland Stewart Taylor, and the jury recommended the death sentence, citing aggravated circumstances. Barfield was imprisoned at Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina, in an area for escape-prone and mentally ill prisoners, as there was no designated area for women under death sentences at the time, and she was the only female death row inmate. Barfield became known as the Death Row Granny. While she was imprisoned, and now that she's off the drugs, Barfield did express remorse for the murders and became a born-again Christian while awaiting trial. During the 6 years she spent at Central Prison, she counseled and ministered to other prisoners. Her final appeal was filed on October 30th, 1984 in the North Carolina Supreme Court on the grounds that she was incompetent at her original trial by virtue of her drug addiction. This was rejected by the court, and this was the last of many appeals and the third one that was rejected by the Supreme Court. So Barfield began writing letters to Governor Jim Hunt in which she argued that her born-again Christian faith should be considered as a mitigating factor for commuting her sentence to life in prison. She garnered a great deal of support from many Christians across the United States, including evangelists Billy and Ruth Graham. Hunt declined to grant clemency and was unimpressed by her religious conversion and good behavior on death row. It is claimed by some that Hunt could not reprieve her without looking soft on crime during the run up to the state elections in 1984. She began to accept her death and instructed her attorney, Jimmy Little, to drop all appeals the day before she was due to be executed, saying that she wanted to, quote, die with dignity. She had little fear of what lay ahead and is actually quoted as saying, quote, when I go into that chamber at 2 a.m., it is my gateway to heaven, end quote. Under North Carolina law, she was allowed the choice of execution by lethal gas or lethal injection, and not surprisingly, she chose the latter. Here's where we get to the last meal. She actually declined her last meal and instead asked a guard to get her Coca-Cola and cheese doodles. Now, we'll get into more on that here in just a moment. Velma Barfield was executed on November 2nd, 1984 at Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina. She was 52 years old at the time of her execution, and she was the first woman put to death by lethal injection in the United States. Now, lots of people have mixed opinions on Velma Barfield. Yes, she committed some horrible crimes. Yes, she did it for poor reasons. She clearly made bad choices. But at the same time, she was a model prisoner and did a lot of good while she was in prison. Now, how does one relate to the other? I'm not sure. That's something that we'll have to delve more into in this podcast, which is one of the purposes. I want to know what you guys think about the relation to the crimes and the death penalty. What warrants being put to death? It's an interesting thought and one that is highly controversial. You have people on both sides of the fence and all with good arguments. Again, we'll get more into that in some more episodes. But for now, I want to talk about her last meal, or better, the lack thereof. Instead of choosing a traditional last meal, she simply chose Coca-Cola and cheese doodles. It says that she asked a guard to get her these items. I read that on multiple sites. And so I'm taking that and making an assumption that he basically just got these things from a vending machine for her. Now, what does that say? Could it be that she chose Coca-Cola and cheese doodles, 2 items out of a vending machine, that any of us at any given time have made a choice if we were out and about and couldn't stop to get anything, couldn't stop to have lunch? You know, you grab something from the vending machine. It's just simple, easy, and quick. However, we know that Barfield didn't have these kind of restraints. She was not in a hurry. She was not working. She was not, needing something easy. She didn't feel like cooking, all that. These were not factors here. She could have had pretty much what she wanted. Instead, she just said, hey, grab me a bag of cheese doodles and a Coke. Could it be that it was because she was nervous? Sometimes when we get nervous, we don't want to eat a lot. We feel nauseated, that type of thing. So I'm going to make the assumption that that's probably why she just wanted these 2 small little items. The other option is that maybe she was trying to send a message that I don't need anything here in this world. She made the quote that said, when she goes into the death chamber, that's her gateway to heaven. So, I'm not going to splurge on extravagant items here on earth. I'm not going to have this big fancy feast as my last meal on earth because I don't need these earthly things. So that's another option that may be the reason why she chose these items. It's also worth noting that she was born in the rural South during the Depression years. She was growing up very poor, So, to someone like her, cheese doodles and Coca Cola would have been an extravagance. Maybe that's something that she never got a lot of in her life, or at least not until she was much older. And I'm figuring that because of her addiction problems and things like that, she didn't really have any spare money. If she did, she wouldn't have been stealing and murdering people for it. So maybe that was just, hey, that's a childhood want. I always wanted this when I was a kid. I can have one thing. This is what I want. That's a possibility, right? I don't know. I think there are so many things, so many conclusions that can be drawn from her choice of a last meal. And it makes you think, if I had to choose one meal for my final meal here on earth, what would I choose and why? Was there even any thought put behind it? Maybe that's just what sounded good to her at the moment. Maybe it really wasn't that deep. We'll never know because she's no longer here to tell us why that was what she chose. What we can do is look on this and maybe try to, in some small way, understand the psyche of a person that committed these atrocities, that committed these horrible crimes, even to the people that she supposedly was supposed to love and take care of, including her own mother. I know for me, my mother is the closest thing to God here on this earth. I love my mother. I mean, I have many wonderful family members and friends, don't get me wrong, but I'm just saying there's something special about the person who brought you in this world. So to think of killing them for financial gain, especially, I mean, that just to me blows my mind. And maybe that's what creates my fascination with these true crime stories like this. I've always tried to understand the psyche and the reasoning of these people who commit these crimes and why they do that. I've just always wanted to try to wrap my mind around how these people could commit these horrible acts. And it's very difficult to do. I can't understand it because fortunately for myself and for others, my mind doesn't work that way. I can't understand why and how these people are able to do what they do. And let's not get it twisted. These are still people. As much as we would like to be able to separate that fact, these are still people. And a lot of times they're people who have had tremendously horrible things happen to them in their past. Now, that's not to say that that's an excuse for them to commit the crimes that they do. But I think you have to look at the person as a whole to maybe gain some understanding about why their mind worked that way. There's never going to be any excuse for them committing these crimes. Her stealing money and killing these people basically to cover it up, that's not a reason, that's not a justification, but it's the only one she could give, and that is what I try to wrap my mind around. The fact that that was her reasoning, the fact that she felt that was the only option, that's what intrigues me. That's what fascinates me. And I hope that you feel the same way because I think this is a very interesting topic. And I think that there are certain parts of these stories that are just not touched on. One being the mental status of the person committing the crime. And I don't mean that they have mental illness or anything like that. I'm just saying where their head was at that time. What were they thinking? How did they justify that to themselves? Or did they? Did they just not have a conscience and that's how they were able to get away with it? And these are people like Velma Barfield who not only committed this crime once, but multiple times. Maybe she enjoyed it. Maybe she felt like, hey, I got away with it once, I can get away with it again. And she almost did. She could have stopped short and probably would have never been found out because it was Stuart Taylor's death that ultimately led to her downfall. But it's interesting to think of what goes on in their mind and try to maybe come up with some kind of scenario that we could possibly understand a little better. And their last meal plays into that because I feel like that says a lot about the person. It still is hard to understand, and we can only draw assumptions from it. But on those assumptions, we can make a conclusion that sits well in our mind and helps us to understand people a little better. I hope that you enjoyed this podcast.